Hello, hope everybody's doing well. This week we're going to review two articles by Terrace, both published in 1963, and I believe this is part of his doctoral dissertation. Then we'll follow up with an article by Touchette and Howard in 1984. So before getting into these articles, upon my once again reviewing them for, I don't know, probably the 50th time, maybe more, I do realize these Terrace articles are pretty dense and there's a lot of information in there. It's basic research and it's early basic research, so there's a lot of complexities. So having said that, we're going to extract some very basic concepts out of these articles, many of which we had already gone over. And the primary one that we're going to focus on is this notion of transferring stimulus control. That is, transferring control from one set of stimuli to a new set of stimuli. And Terrace, or this set of articles or research by Terrace, was really the seminal articles for describing a procedure by which we could introduce prompts, if you will, or new stimuli and fade those stimuli out to create this sort of transfer of stimulus control. So keep that in mind as we go through. We're not going to dig into all of the data of these articles, but I do want to highlight some things that will be relevant to practice. And then, of course, the Touchette article is perhaps equally as difficult as a read, even though it involves human participants. But again, the focus here is on transfer of stimulus control, right? So you should know these procedures as sort of prompting procedures and prompt fading procedures. So essentially we are generating some form of a response, getting responding to occur. We may have to use prompts, whether they are stimulus prompts or response prompts, but eventually we need to fade those prompts out. So kind of moving along from the basic literature into the applied realm. And after this week, we will be moving more into the literature on stimulus control. That will probably be relevant to most of you in applied practice. So keep that in mind as well. So the first Terrace article, he starts out in the introduction basically introducing the concept of operant discrimination. And this is something we've talked about. So he states that it's a process whereby an organism comes to respond more frequently to a stimulus correlated with reinforcement than a stimulus correlated with non-reinforcement. So again, obviously we've talked about this, and when we focus on the basic literature, we see that the general arrangement for training this form of a discrimination is a rat or a pigeon in an operant chamber. The chamber is equipped with lights, perhaps a green light or a red light. Doesn't have to be a visual discrimination, but most of the time it is. And those red and green lights or stimuli are associated with reinforcement versus extinction. And the notation that's used is S plus for the stimulus correlated with reinforcement, S minus for the stimulus correlated with non-reinforcement or extinction. The other thing that we should note before we start getting into the discussion of these articles is the process whereby we're training an operant discrimination can take a couple different forms, but I think in these early studies, it's what we might call a simultaneous discrimination, where, consecutive discrimination, where training to the S plus occurs first, then there's training to the S minus, or you could alternate between the S plus and the S minus, but they're not available at the same time, as opposed to a simultaneous discrimination where both response options are available at the same time. So keep them in mind as we go through the procedures. So the thing that's interesting about Terrace's article is that most of the data up to this point in 1963 showed that during this sort of training, operant discrimination training, there were responses to the S minus, as one might expect, right? If you're training a discrimination between any form of stimuli early on, you would expect the participant to make some errors, that is, respond to the S minus instead of the S plus. And in fact, and Terrace notes this in the article, the conventional thinking at the time based on these data was that responding to S minus or making errors is a necessary part of learning and discrimination. So again, thereby, if the participant or organism is being taught to make this discrimination, some errors are necessary in order for the discrimination to be acquired. Terrace thought, however, that one, it might be possible to utilize technology to train discriminations and minimize the amount of errors. And he also thought that the very errors that were occurring, that is responding to the S minus rather, is a function or maybe a function of how and when the S minus is introduced. So again, keep in mind, if we're thinking of a discrimination procedure whereby the S plus is presented, there's a response to it, and then the S minus comes up. This notion of how we're going to present that S minus may play a role in the number of errors that are being made. So we set up two experiments, basically to evaluate different approaches to introducing the S minus during discrimination training. In experiment 1, he used a 2-component multiple schedule. So you should know a multiple schedule is a complex schedule with 2 or more components, each that are signaled by unique stimuli. So in this case, it's a red light and a green light. And during experiment 1, S plus component was in effect for 3 minutes, followed by 3 minutes of the S minus. And I'm jumping ahead here, but if I remember correctly, the S plus stimulus is actually a red stimulus, and the S minus was green. Then he conducted a second experiment to teach discrimination learning, where reinforced response to S plus was made available during short trials. So as opposed to this sort of session-based responding can occur multiple times to keys, it was one response to each key, put the other schedule into effect. So you peck red, red goes away, and then green comes up. Okay, there were, the participants were pigeons. They used an operant chamber that had response keys and various components that you would expect. Lights, red and green lights, food hopper, and so forth. The pigeons were actually split into different groups according to the different experimental conditions. So the dependent variables, the 2 main dependent variables that we're going to focus on are the number of pecks to the S minus, which again was the green light, and the latency of response to the S plus. Now, if you think back to the Dinsmore article, Dinsmore did talk about using a latency measure to measure responding to the S plus as sort of an indice of the strength of a discrimination. So you could think of it this way, that obviously a peck to green is an incorrect response. If the discrimination is acquired and is strong, as soon as the S plus comes up, the participant should be responding pretty quickly to it. If there are latencies to responding to the S plus, that would be some indication or indice that the discrimination is not strong, or perhaps there's sort of a delay in observing the S plus stimulus. So we divided the pigeons into 4 groups, each of which were associated with a different procedure for introducing the S minus. The early progressive condition was one in which the S minus is faded in 30 seconds into the session. So again, think of these as sessions. Pigeon is in the operant chamber, session begins. The S plus is presented and responses to the S plus are reinforced. And in this condition, the S minus appeared about 30 seconds into the session. So it wasn't there immediately. Essentially, they established responding to the S plus. Then they gradually fade in the S minus starting about 30 seconds. The other condition was early constant. So the S minus was presented at full brightness early in the session. The late progressive, the S minus, was faded in after 21 S plus sessions. So long exposure to S plus and then gradually fading in the S minus. Then the late constant, S minus, presented at full brightness 21 sessions after the S plus. So again, another way to think of this is they're obviously comparing different ways of introducing the S minus, one in which it's sort of immediately presented or more immediately presented. One, it's presented only after a certain amount of exposure to the S plus. And you could sort of expand on that in considering the fact that longer exposure to S plus would really establish correct responding to that stimulus. Okay, and then of course they used a two-component multiple schedule, reinforcement and extinction. We don't need to really get into the variable interval components in as much detail. In experiment 2, the main difference was that rather than having a session, right, a time-based session, the components of the schedule, the S plus versus S minus, or the VI schedule versus extinction, was alternated according to each response that was made. So a single response on the S plus terminated S plus and switched to the S minus. And trials were terminated if a response occurred to the any key, or if a failure to respond within 5 seconds at the onset of the trial. So if the pigeon did not peck within 5 seconds of the S minus, it switched back to the S plus. And again, they use the early progressive, early constant, late progressive, and late constant methods for introducing S minus. And here are the results. So these results are maybe a little difficult to see, but they're measuring the number of responses to the S minus. And I'm even having a hard time here. Let me switch to the article. Okay. So the dark bars represent the first 3 S plus S minus sessions, and the shaded bars represent all 28 S plus S minus sessions. But the key finding here is that responding to S minus was very low or almost non-existent in the early progressive method. So that is, when doing this discrimination training, it seemed to benefit, at least the pigeons in this case, if the S minus was introduced early, but in a progressive fashion. Okay. You do see also a few responses to the S minus during the early constant and the late progressive, particularly relative to the late constant. So the takeaway there, I think, would be that this procedure of gradually introducing the S minus early, but still in this gradual fashion, produce the best outcomes. These are the number of responses to the S plus according to each condition, number of responses to the S minus, and it's across the discrimination sessions. So the x-axis is the discrimination sessions, and you see early on that there are responses to the S minus, almost in all the conditions, but then that decreases over time. Interestingly enough, in that late constant, you see that responding did decrease across sessions, but overall, the early progressive arrangement proved to be better. He conducted a series of control experiments just really to determine whether or not the results gathered from the first experiments were a product of the procedure. So I don't want to spend too much time in this area, but he thought that, one, maybe a reduction in the probability of a response to the S minus during the early stages of the early progressive session accounted for the presentation of the S minus because the bird's head was turned away from the key, right? So he developed a control arrangement for that. Then he thought perhaps another artifact could have resulted from the fact that there was a correction procedure. We didn't really talk about the correction procedure, but for the purposes of what we're trying to get out of this article, that's not really relevant. And that the control was designed to account for assumed preference of red versus green. So essentially, rather than S plus being red and S minus being green, he switched the discrimination. So in the control experiment, S minus was introduced independent of the bird's behavior. SDs were reversed. So again, as mentioned, the S plus was green, S minus was red. They didn't use a correction procedure. And he had a couple other manipulations in there. So overall, with the results that we focused on, there were other ones. They showed the cumulative records and so forth. But overall, what we see from this early line of research is that by fading in the S minus, it was possible for the participants to obtain an operant discrimination with few or no errors. And again, that was groundbreaking at the time because most researchers believe that errors were required to learn the discrimination. And these data are showing clearly that's not the case. He also mentioned in the discussion that the accuracy of the discrimination performance was best for the birds who did not respond to the S minus during acquisition. So again, this is something that I'm sure we've talked about before when discussing stimulus control, but if you have a general teaching arrangement, perhaps of differential reinforcement, and errors are made, that could prolong learning, right? So the fact that no errors are made, learning could progress a little more rapidly. So let's jump right into the second article, errorless transfer of discrimination across two continua. So again, to kind of keep things simple, this is basically an extension of the article we just reviewed, and he became very interested in this procedure of progressively introducing or fading stimuli in and out to transfer stimulus control. So basically what he wanted to do here was utilize that procedure first to establish a red-green discrimination and then to transfer control from the easy red-green discrimination to a more difficult discrimination, and it was a line orientation, horizontal versus vertical line. So again, what we're talking about here is just simply the early research showing how stimuli could be faded to transfer stimulus control. So there were 8 pigeons, again, sort of divided into groups according to experimental session. And discrimination training first included a red-green discrimination. So red was S plus, green was S minus. Then a line discrimination, a vertical line versus horizontal line. Again, different procedures were compared. One was, or different conditions rather, abrupt, that is 15 sessions of the red-green discrimination occurred, followed by abruptly introducing the vertical and horizontal line on white keys. So sort of no fading in that sense. The superimposition condition, again, there were 15 sessions of the red-green discrimination, and then the lines were superimposed immediately on the color keys. Then there was the superimposition and fading condition. So again, after 15 sessions of red-green, lines were superimposed on the colors, followed by the colors fading until it was only the lines on the white keys. And then another condition, vertical, horizontal training only. And this essentially describes the different sessions and the different experimental conditions. Okay, so I've showed this before, although now on another review of this article, I realized that the line was not an angle line; it was a horizontal line. So the basic arrangement here is you first train up a red-green discrimination, and then once that's acquired, you introduce the new stimuli onto the already established discriminative stimuli, and over the consecutive sessions, you're going to minimize those colors until you end up with the final discrimination. So here are the results following those procedures. Again, we see this sort of procedure where we're using stimulus fading, or what they're going to call superimposition and fading, produced the fewest amount of responses to the S minus, right? So again, it's sort of an indice of discrimination performance that no responses are being made or no errors are being made to the S minus. So that sort of indicates that a discrimination is formed. There's only responses to the S plus. So that condition produced the best learning. Now, of course, some of the other ones produced pretty accurate responding as well, and fewer errors to the S minus. There was also a follow-up here where after this sort of superimposition and fading, they went back to the red-green discrimination. So you see in the dark bars, it is the second red-green discrimination that's being plotted. The white bars are the vertical line discrimination. And it's interesting that you see even after that discrimination was established, in the other conditions, you see that some errors are made to the red-green in the second follow-up to that, the second condition of red-green discrimination. So in other words, this was a discrimination the pigeons had already learned. But then after the line discrimination, when they went back to the red-green, suddenly there are errors made. So that became interesting. Why did that happen? Okay, so we'll talk about that in the second experiment. Here's some more data. This is the mean latency of responding to the S plus for each bird in the conditions, and you can see the different conditions here. So the superimposition and fading, you see that the latency really didn't change from the red-green discrimination into the vertical line discrimination, as well as in the second red-green discrimination. But in other conditions, there was a change in the latency to responding. So essentially, in the second experiment, he wanted to determine why were there responses to the S minus during the second red-green discrimination, and well, we'll talk about it after the results. But the basic line of thinking was perhaps the line discrimination training interfered with the already acquired discrimination in some way, right? So because the lines acquired stimulus control over responding when the red-green discrimination was reintroduced, maybe that interrupted responding, the performance that was initially there. So what he did was he carried out that line discrimination longer. So one might suspect that the longer you're exposed to a new discrimination, the more the first discrimination, the red-green, might deteriorate. Okay, so here are the results. Again, we're looking at the number of responses to the S minus, few responses to the S minus during the vertical line discrimination, as well as the second red-green discrimination. But in that abrupt procedure, you do see, again, a lot of responding to the S minus. So it seemed as if the longer exposure to the line discrimination did worsen performance the second time the red-green was introduced. Again, here's the latency responses to the S plus. So generally, taking as a whole, these two articles show that at least pigeons can learn an easy to difficult discrimination without making errors by using this, what we now know as a stimulus fading procedure. So by transferring stimulus control from an easy discrimination to a hard discrimination, we could teach discrimination performances, in the absence of making errors. So this has obvious implications for teaching children of all sorts, but clearly children with developmental disabilities who may have difficulty learning discriminations between letters, numbers, colors, shapes. It showed that there's a technology that we could use and we can apply to help them. Okay, So that's those two articles. And as mentioned, they are pretty dense, and I hope you didn't struggle with them too much. There's a lot of information that we sort of didn't touch on that are, again, not that it's not important, but for what we're trying to get out of it in the applied realm, the fading procedure and the outcomes of that procedure, I think, are most relevant. So with that, let's move over to the Touchette article. So once again, this article is focusing on the topic of transfer of stimulus control. And you can see in the title, errorless learning, right? That's sort of one way we could classify these procedures, or the effect that's occurring. That is, the participants, whether pigeons or in this case humans, are acquiring a discrimination, making few errors. So it's as if they are learning errorlessly. We tend to be more specific in our procedures in saying that we're either using stimulus fading or, as noted in this article, prompt delay. So we'll talk about delayed prompting, and there's a specific thing I want you to get out of this delayed prompt procedure. So at this point, you should know that occasionally we will use prompts in our instruction to generate responding that may not be under the appropriate stimulus control, right? So if you're trying to teach a child to wash his or her hands, there's a variety of stimuli that should control responding. For example, the instruction, wash your hands, the presence of the soap, the presence of the faucet, or the water, all the things needed to wash hands. But if those things do not control responding, then we may use prompting. So we may say wash hands and then physically guide the individual to turn on the water. We could pull out the soap dispenser. If they do not use it, then we might physically guide them to use the soap dispenser and so forth. So prompts are very useful, and if we need to use them, we certainly should be using them. The problem with prompts is we have to be very careful, because if we remove them too soon, we might start getting a lot of incorrect responding. And if incorrect responding becomes frequent, that's going to prolong our teaching. The other limitation is that if we use prompts too long, then it can result in prompt dependence, and that sort of makes fading those prompts more difficult. So it's sort of like this fine line we have to walk between ensuring we're using prompts effectively and frequently enough, but also making sure we have a systematic plan for removing them when we can. And it's obviously we're going to base our removal of the prompts or fading of the prompts on the data. So in order to prevent prompt dependency, we have to remove or fade these prompts, and that ends up being a method of transferring stimulus control. So if we are using prompts, the response that we're prompting is under the control of the prompt, right? So that's a form of stimulus control. But we need the response to be under the control of some other stimulus. In the hand washing example, the instruction or the presence of the sink, faucet, bathroom, so forth. So there's a procedure known as delayed prompting. Delayed prompting involves adding a prompt after some delay. And one of the things that I'll highlight is this is sort of a procedure whereby in our early instruction, the prompts are immediately delivered, right? So I say wash your hands, and I immediately guide the individual to physically wash his or her hands. After a couple sessions or trials of doing that, then I insert the delay. So for example, a 0-second delay to start, I say wash your hands, physically guide the person to wash his or her hands. After so many trials, then I insert the delay. I say wash your hands, and maybe I wait 1 to 2 seconds before prompting. And what I'm looking for, or I'm providing, is an opportunity for the individual to respond before I prompt. Okay, but I'm going to systematically increase the duration of this delay, and hopefully we should start to see responding before the prompts. So responding that occurs after the delay are under control of the prompt, right? So if the individual waits out the time to the point where I have to provide prompting, then stimulus control has not been transferred. Response latencies that are shorter than the delay indicate that stimulus control has shifted, right? So if the individual begins responding before the delay runs out and before I have to prompt, then certainly the response is under the control of the appropriate stimuli. So the purpose of the question was to one, look at that procedure, but also to consider this notion of exaggerated discrepancies in reinforcement. Right. So in other words, not only are we going to use a prompt procedure and a prompt delay procedure, but is there a way we can arrange a reinforcement contingency to favor responding before the prompt is introduced? Okay, so keep that in mind. That's really the main focus of the article. There are some other things. So we're going to look at the schedule of reinforcement to help shift stimulus control from prompts to other stimuli. So there are 3 students diagnosed with severe developmental disabilities. They use the term mental retardation. I updated it. The setting was a training center that the students attended. They also used some token reinforcement during sessions. So the participants were taught to make a visual discrimination using 4 stimulus cards. And each student had different discriminations: letters, 4-letter words, letters and numerals. So the experimenter basically presented the stimuli and delivered the SD, point to or touch, followed by the S plus presentation of the S plus card. Positions of the cards, the S plus and the S minus, were varied. And then they had a criterion for mastery, right? So when is the discrimination acquired? And they used 9 correct unprompted responses within 10 consecutive trials. So a session was 10 trials. If the individual responded correctly, unprompted, then that signaled mastery. Okay, they also did some pre-tests just to ensure that the stimuli that were being used were not already in the child's repertoire. The schedules of reinforcement were as such. So basically, we're looking at providing reinforcement for correct responses occurring prior to the prompt and correct responses coinciding with or occurring after the prompt. So in other words, I respond before the prompt, or I wait for the prompt to occur before making the correct response. So condition A, the reinforcement contingencies are equal. That is a continuous reinforcement schedule for responses that occur prior to the prompt, and a continuous schedule reinforcement to the responding that occurs after the prompt. Condition B, continuous schedule reinforcement for responses that occur before the prompt, and FR3 for responses that occur coinciding or after the prompt. And then condition C, FR3 for responding that occurs before the prompt, CRF for reinforcement that occurs, responding that occurs after the prompt. So what we should be looking for is, we would expect this one, condition B, to produce better performance because reinforcement is favoring responses that occur before the prompt. So in other words, the individual is going to, during this discrimination training, contact this contingency whereby if they respond before the prompt, continuous reinforcement. If they wait for the prompt, it's an FR3. So every 3 trials, reinforcement might be available. So it would be more advantageous for the individual to respond before the prompt. Okay, so I'm not going to read these general procedures, but I think you get the idea of a general discrimination training context. So trial by trial, the experimenter is presenting the S plus and then the S minus, saying touch or point to the S plus. Positioning the S plus and S minus are switched randomly according to each trial. The thing that I want you to focus on is this delay procedure. So in a prompt delay procedure, initially on the early sessions or maybe early trials, the stimuli are presented, or the SD is presented, for example, touch A, and the therapist touches A, right? So the prompt is immediately there. So you lay out the stimuli S plus, S minus, you say touch A while touching A. The individual touches A, great job, and you move on to the next trial. So when there are 4 consecutive responses, so they're doing this across trials, 4 consecutive responses to the S plus produced a 0.5 second increase in the delay before the prompt. So now, after these 4 consecutive responses, or we'll just say trials, the stimuli S plus and S minus are presented. The SD, for example, touch A is presented, then a 5-second delay, 0.5 second delay. That's a very short delay. Then the point prompt is provided. Okay, so they follow this procedure until they get to a maximum of 5 seconds for 2 of the students and then 8 seconds for another student. Okay, again, tokens are being delivered. The other thing that I think is important is if there were incorrect responses, the therapist basically said no, turned away. So it was a brief timeout. They turned away from the child from 10 seconds. The other thing that's important is if there were 2 consecutive incorrect responses, the delay was shortened, right? So this is sort of a continuum. As long as there's correct responding, we lengthen the delay. If there are 2 consecutive errors, we shorten it. The other thing I want to highlight about this is just this systematic nature by which they're doing this fading procedure, right? So you have a criterion for increasing the delay, and then you have a criterion for shortening the delay if necessary. So these are things we have to think about, and if we were drafting a protocol, we'd have to write that into the protocol. They also did a random order test to determine whether the verbal stimuli spoken at the outset of each trial had some stimulus control, acquired some stimulus control. So they basically conducted training sessions that were similar to what was just described, but the S plus was changed on every trial, right? So for example, if they were saying touch A on every trial, they wanted to control for that and have a different S plus on every trial. They didn't use a shortened delay for the incorrect response, and the point prompt was only presented if the child failed to respond after the delay. They also followed up with a generalization test. Okay, so you have this flow chart. I'm not going to go through it because we kind of did just go through it, but it is a nice way of sort of understanding what happens. Trials presented. Is there a correct response? Yes, then this happens. If there's an incorrect response, no, this happens. So a nice way of sort of presenting the format and structure of the sessions. So data were collected on correct pre-prompted and incorrect pre-prompt, correct post-prompt, and incorrect post-prompt. So correct and incorrect responses that occurred either before or after the prompt. And here are results. So what they're measuring, interestingly enough, is a delay at transfer in seconds. Okay, so you could see under the CRF schedule, right? So reinforcement is not favoring responding before or after the prompt. You get these performances for each subject. Under the in an alternating treatment design, they looked at the accuracy of responding, and we see that the transfer occurred much earlier for all the participants under the CRF FR3. So the schedule that favored responding before the prompts and had the FR3 for responses that occurred after the prompts. Okay, so in all cases, that proved to be better. So in other words, we see that all of the participants responded at high levels during the experimental conditions. The trials to meet criterion were fewer in the CRF FR3, so in the B condition. So basically, all three of the experimental conditions did produce transfer, but the B condition produced the earliest transfer. Okay, the altered contingencies of reinforcement affected the tendency to wait for the prompt, but they did not significantly alter the probability of making errors. So these arranging a reinforcement contingency did seem to have some effect on transfer of stimulus control, but it didn't really have an effect on how many errors were made. But I think the take home of this article, again, paired with the Terrace article, provides us some things to think about when we're teaching visual discriminations. And I should make that clear. Right now, we've been talking primarily about visual discriminations. There are auditory discriminations and ways to transfer stimulus control there too, but for now, let's just stay focused on visual discriminations. Obviously, stimulus fading is a very effective procedure, and we should use it if we have to. These data from this article are showing that the rate of transfer can be accelerated by disparate response consequences. So that is, we could arrange reinforcement contingencies to favor responses that occur before the prompt. Okay, so not only are we just using a fading procedure, but we're sort of tying in the concepts and principles of using reinforcement and the density of reinforcement according to the schedule to help transfer stimulus control, or another way to think of it is speed up the acquisition of the discrimination. Okay, so by providing the higher reinforcement probability for responding before the prompt, you get a more rapid transfer of stimulus control. So although there was sort of a lot of details in these articles, and they're early, obviously 1963, even 1984, I think a lot of the articles written at that time tend to be very wordy and confusing and so forth, but hopefully you got some of the main points of these articles, and hopefully this lecture sort of cleared up some of the things that I'm expecting you to focus on. So with that, there will be a brief quiz on these two articles. I do want to point out that next week we are starting with the student presentation. So it's going to give me a little break here. Each of you will be presenting an article kind of in this methodology that I've been, just voice over a PowerPoint, and that'll help us sort of expand our contact with this literature. Okay, so have a good week. If there are questions, feel free to email me.